experts who use technology to fuel innovations in brain health. This is Brain Tech Project Podcast. So here I am with Dr. Dave Lechuga. And if I were to use one word to describe him, it would be discipline at his core. And so now here we are today to talk about how to take our discipline to the next level. Thanks, Dr. Lechuga. Let's just dive right into some of the expertise that I know you have, and that's testimony and legal work.
Sure.
I'd like you to share a little bit about the work you've done, and especially as it relates to testimony, an area that I think is untapped in terms of our training.
Sure. Well, for the last probably about 20 years, I've done more expert witness work, and it's been primarily within personal injury litigation. And initially, the work started as a primary treating doctor who was asked to come in as a recipient witness or a treating doctor. And then I would just testify about that case, and I couldn't opine beyond that case. I couldn't give like an expert opinion about, say, how an injury is evaluated in general in the field, things like that. But over time, firms started to approach me to give expert witness examinations, primarily for the defense, it seemed like, for the first, I would say, 10 years. And then in the last 10 years, the balance has shifted, not completely toward defense, but probably certainly more toward defense. Not sure what that's about, but I think a good expert is usually more even as far as their plaintiff versus defense type cases. If you're skewed in one direction or the other, then often you kind of get perceived as somewhat of an advocate for one side or the other, and maybe not as objective as you'd like to be. So that's how I evolved into it. And then I do a lot of expert witness work these days. A little quieter now with the COVID crisis, but that's understandable.
Yeah. So how do you think, if you were to share with someone how to get started, trainee, early career professional, what do you think would be some initial steps that someone could take today?
Well, I think it's always good to be around someone who does this work. So meet with them, talk with them, if you can, observe how they do it, because there's different phases, right? There's certainly an examination phase, which usually presumes that you're reviewing records ahead of time or concurrently with doing the examination. Some experts are a little different in their methodology, but everyone assesses primarily the same. They may even use similar tools, so you have to be aware of that. But I think the things that are important to understand is how the expert actually functions. Like, how do they interview? How do they gather the information? How do they present themselves in the examination, start to finish? It's really important, and really need to develop your presence, because that's what goes into the next phase, which is deposition testimony and then trial testimony, where you share your expertise with whoever's deposing you or whoever's examining or cross-examining you in front of a jury or a judge or both.
Yeah, and I think that that's where, we've talked a little bit about human connection. And I think now, as we're having a lot of discussion, and we will talk today, especially about technology and tele-neuropsychology and its role as well, is how relatable are we going to be to the public? And I know that that's an area you're really passionate about. What do you think are just a couple things a neuropsychologist needs to keep in mind when actually testifying with the jury there?
Sure. I think you have to realize your opinion is probably not going to make or break the case. So be careful about placing too much importance on what you think is valuable information, because the case may not really hinge on your testimony, although neuropsychological testimony is important. It may hinge on a procedural issue or a decision made by a judge about whether certain evidence is in or not. That doesn't diminish our importance, but I do think we have to approach the task of providing information in a very honorable way. So you have to really check your biases and scrutinize those biases. The problem is most experts are like an N of one. They don't really have a group practice per se, or other folks that you may talk to about a case or consult, because it's really you. You're at point or on point. But I think you can certainly talk with colleagues about testimony and presenting yourself. But I think this whole ability to understand a human being has to be viewed with humility, and you have to accept that you may be seeing things incorrectly and that your opinions may not be fully informed. So you have to make concessions without being too self-effacing, because there has to be some degree of professionalism and confidence as well. But at the same time, that has to be balanced with what you do not know. And it's important to convey that, because I think the juries that I've heard from, not directly but indirectly from attorneys who always debrief the jurors, they find out what worked, what didn't work. What I've always heard is that if they feel like they trust an expert, then they're more inclined to listen what that expert has to say. If they feel like they cannot trust that expert, obviously it goes in the other direction. Also, if they feel like the expert is unlikable, not that you have to be somebody's pal or make them like you, but if they feel like they can't relate to you, like you're kind of abrasive and agitated and irritable on the stand, then they're going to feel less inclined to listen to you.
Yeah.
That's
So
just,
I think, yeah, I think like what you're summarizing is basically, about a self-assessment. I like that you brought up about humility. And I know another area that you're an expert in that maybe some other people don't know is that you have 5 degrees black belts. Is that correct?
I'm a fifth degree black belt. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
called a godan. And anybody knows Japanese, go is 5, dan is level. So I'm a godan, and yeah, I don't share that too much with people.
I wanted to bring up, how do you think that that's important to go to neuropsych in terms of self-assessment when doing legal work? And also, you've brought up also asking people, learning from colleagues.
Right, right. Well, I think in some ways, being a martial artist has probably stunted my growth as a neuropsychologist, because the hours I spend training probably could have been spent studying or writing publications, doing research and maybe advancing myself a little bit more in the field. But I was willing to make that trade-off. I'm willing to be thought less of by colleagues because of my credentials, or maybe credentials not being at par with somebody else, and trade that for being a martial artist. Because I think being a martial artist, or anyone who really devotes themselves to a particular discipline, forces you to look at yourself. And you cannot advance in our martial art very far unless you've really faced yourself and your areas of strength and your areas of weakness, and you accept that you're never perfect. You're only an approximation of the next iteration, the next phase. And you have to train for your entire life. And the wish is that before the martial artist passes away, with their last breath, they can take a look around, so to speak, and say, how have I done?
Mm-hmm.
And who have I helped?
Mm-hmm.
And have I been a good human being? The goal is to make you competent as a martial artist, but primarily to make you a good human being, to build character, and that's it. That's the primary purpose.
Yeah. How do you think that translates to neuropsychology?
Well, I like the idea of being a student. That's why I like graduate school. I really loved graduate school, because I thought, wait a minute, I can go to school and answer questions. I can pose questions and answer questions. You're going to teach me. And it's similar to martial art. You have to be a student. In fact, we are always a student of someone. Like if in Japan, for example, I was in Japan a couple of years ago, and we were there with our instructor. And so when someone asks you formally about your training, then I would say something to the effect of, all my rank was obtained from Tsusumu Oshima. Tsusumu Oshima is a direct student of Gichin Funakoshi. Gichin Funakoshi is the originator of karate. My first instructor was Mr. Don Dupree, and my other instructors, and I say who they are, but my lineage is from Gichin Funakoshi, Tsusumu Oshima, Don Dupree, and Dave Lechuga, and my students. And that would be formal introduction.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to say anything else. So I'm someone's student and I'm someone's teacher. In martial arts, we have a concept of 3 lives. It's more of an Asian concept. The feeling being that your life is out of balance if you don't have a senior, your life and a junior. So we always have a senior, someone we look up to. We have our life that we try to live the best that we can for as long as we can. And then we have someone that we share information with, because the wish is that junior will be better than you.
Mhm.
If your junior's not better than you, then from an instructor's point of view, you failed. They don't have to beat you up. They don't have to, do something much better than you in karate per se, but you want them to learn more than you've learned in your lifetime, or else it's a failure experience that could last many, many decades. You do not want to have students that stay at your level. You need them to exceed your level, or else it's considered a failure for a teacher.
And I know that one of our mutual passions is in mentoring and training the next generation. So as you're talking, I can't help but want to hear more, and for you to share with others how that concept and even academic training, and then now this kind of model of, when we even introduce ourselves, when we talk about our training,
Yes.
even when you're across from a lawyer discussing what your training is,
Sure.
how would you share that? For example, even at a presentation, and then kind of transition back into a legal standpoint.
Well, first of all, you have to consider, I think, very good question. I think you have to consider perceptions. And people have perceptions based on what they know of certain areas. Like I was trained at UCLA. I have my doctorate from UCLA. And very few people get into that school. I was stunned that I got in. I thought, what are they doing accepting me? I don't understand that. And because all my colleagues are from Ivy League schools. And I didn't really feel like I belonged. But I thought, I'm going to take this shot anyway. So they let me
I
in.
had a similar experience. I remember applying for internship and being afraid to apply for Emory. And I'll never forget Dr. Mike Westervold saying, if you don't apply, you're not getting in.
That's right. But we all bring baggage, right, to these things. And so I think that's been helpful. When I grew up, there was a fair amount of overt racism. I grew up in Los Angeles and Carson, just the other side of Compton. And it was not cool to be brown. In fact, you were thought to be more of a criminal or not as bright. All these things that were just ridiculous. But you internalize that. And so I think what I like about that is it's always given me a sense of connection to the ground. Because when someone believes that you're not much higher than the ground, then you can't fall very far. You really just say, okay, people expect me to fail. And you see that even today. I see that with experts. There's perceptions based on your background, your training, your expertise. So I think the general point is you deal with people's perceptions about your training and background, but ultimately it's you. It's you that you have to bring forward. And I can only go so far. What I like about talking to you or some of the other psychologists that have come after me is, boy, they really get a lot more, understand a lot more, and see things in a way that's different than the way that I've seen things, which is fantastic, I think. I really like that, because then I feel better that the field's going to go in an interesting direction. It can't be linear. It's got to be sometimes linear and sometimes non-linear. Mm-hmm. So when I have mentors, when I happen to talk to somebody as a mentor, I really am curious about what they see, because their eyes see things that I cannot see. And I think that's wonderful.
Definitely. I'd like you to walk through maybe a few scenarios just to give the listeners an idea of the tone or mannerism, how you would actually talk with a lawyer, with a case, maybe a deposition or cross-examine, maybe something recently that's come up for you, just so people could kind of listen in to how to do that, how to have that conversation.
Sure. So frequently attorneys will call me. Like today I had a couple of calls, and I've got some tomorrow, and they'll say, I want to run some things about a case by you. And they may not retain you, but like yesterday, for example, an attorney for a large municipality that's being sued by an individual who slipped and fell on their property called me and said, I'd like to run a case by you, Dr. Lechuga. And I took your deposition years ago. That's frequently how they get a sample of your behavior. It's a great sample of one's behavior when you're in a deposition or at trial, because they often sit in the courtroom to watch you testify just to get a sense of how you come across. But this attorney, this woman, had some questions for me about how I would think about a case. And this was a case wherein there was a mild traumatic brain injury and there were some orthopedic injuries. And she had some particular questions about what's my understanding of the natural course of recovery from an uncomplicated mild traumatic brain injury. So I told her what we understand, what the literature tells us is a fairly benign prognosis for the most part, unless there are other complicating factors. And so I started asking, does she have any pre-existing vulnerabilities? And I kind of went through things like learning issues, linguistic, cultural issues that might be considered factors as it interacts with how you test or respond to an illness. And so that opens a discussion. And I don't have to be the expert then. I just have to ask a question or two and then let them interview me. Mm-hmm. And they listen, I'm not on stage, but they listen to your pacing, how you present. You do a lot of like that type of packaging. So you have to be very careful about your language and present professionally. Without being fake, and that's the balance point. So that's an example of a discussion I would have with them.
I think another hot topic in the field, and I know we've had these conversations, is on effort testing.
Oh yeah.
Can you give an example of how you would manage that in the courtroom?
So first of all, let's keep in mind that that's just a tool. It's a tool first of all, and it's a psychometric tool, and we're talking about probabilities, not truth. So probabilities. And sometimes people get a little confused and they think that if you have fails, there's even terms that are used, pass or fail. Mm-hmm. So you have to think about what that language connotes. If someone passes versus fails, if someone's credible versus not credible. So just keep in mind, these are probabilities, and any good scientist knows that you're going to be wrong 5 out of 100 times in your scientific testing. So you have to accept you're going to be wrong sometimes. That being said, good examples on cross would be Dr. Lechuga. I'd like to turn to your deposition testimony, page 4, when I asked you specifically about these performance validity tests that you administer. Do you recall that, Dr. Lechuga? If I did my homework, then I re-reviewed my deposition testimony. If I didn't, I would say, well, I'm not quite sure. And they would say, then they wouldn't even go to the content and say, wait a minute, Dr. Lechuga, you were hired by so-and-so's law firm to be an expert, were you not? Yes. They may get an objection for being argumentative, particularly if they go along the line of, well, Dr. Lechuga, I just don't understand. You're here to give us, and he will look or she will look at the jury and say, you're here to give us your honest opinion about this case. Are you not, Dr. Lechuga? Well, yes. You are being honest, right, Dr. Lechuga? Well, yeah. He'll get an objection there for being argumentative for sure, maybe even taunting. And so, Dr. Lechuga, you're not prepared? You came here today. How much are they paying you for your testimony, which is a classic trap? How much are you being paid for your testimony? You're not being paid for your testimony, you're being paid for your time. But if they rattle you, particularly if you're a junior expert, you'll slip and say, well, I'm being paid X amount of money for my testimony. So you're being paid to kind of provide an answer then, not necessarily the truth. Isn't that true, Dr. Lechuga? You need to go like that. Okay, it devolves from there. But let's kind of bring it back to what I would do. And let's say the person I examined did have elevated scores. And what attorneys get a hand on everything. So let's say they've got all the research on the fake bad scale. And they're saying, look, you got a T-score of this, you got a T-score of that, and you got all these things that say this person is providing unusual, rare combinations and probably non-credible. Isn't that true, Dr. Lechuga? And what's incumbent upon the examiner is to look at the data, take a step back and say, how does this data make sense given the current clinical situation? And then you go from there.
Great.
Now, some situations, a person is non-credible. And then you have to say, it's my my test results are difficult to use because the person didn't seem to be giving their best effort when I examined them, and you go from there.
Mhm. Definitely. Thank you so much for giving that example. A couple other things that I think people want to know with the inside kind of Dr. Dave's presence in the courtroom is any kind of particular visuals, graphics, other things that you found helpful, analogies in just describing things to a jury.
Sure. Well, first of all, you're the primary visual.
Mm-hmm.
So whether you like it or not, they're going to pay attention to you and see you like any humans would do and observe you. We have some great research that talks about this whole thing. There's a whole body of research on jury selection, and it just looks at perceived bias and how do you screen in or screen out certain jurors for your case in this aspect called voir dire, right at the beginning of a trial. But the point is, you're the first visual. So how you walk, how you dress, how you present, how you approach is all very important. To me, I look at a courtroom the same way I look at a church. And I look at the judge and the jury very respectfully. So when I come in, it's actually, to me, it's more like a dojo. And you may or may not know, but when I go in, whenever you go into a dojo, you can tell right away someone who's trained before, because they'll take off their shoes and they'll bow. And how they bow tells you a lot. You can tell tremendous amount by how someone bows. Someone does this versus someone goes, okay? So it's level already, but it takes level to see level.
Mm-hmm.
And you come in the courtroom, present, and good morning, Your Honor. Good afternoon, to whomever. Always greet. Even the bailiff, whoever's, there's not many bailiffs these days, but you always pay attention to the court reporter, because if you speak too quickly, it's really hard on them. Consider all that. And
So
the
smart,
visuals,
Dave.
the visuals then have to do with what's important. What are your points? If you overwhelm, slide here, slide there, well, credible people present here, non-credible people present there. Attorneys love that, because they'll say, well, tell me about the sample pool in your non-credible sample. And my client is not like that person. So why are you comparing apples to grapefruit? It doesn't make sense. So your visuals should only make a point. And sometimes I'll have a slide or two. I don't have a lot. Or sometimes I'll just draw. Like I'll draw a normal distribution and I'll say, here's where we expect them to fall. Here's where they fell. So it's unusual. And explain. So it's in the service of your points, and your points shouldn't be as long-winded as I am now. You answer a question, yes, no. Try not to give a narrative, but teach as you answer a question. And where you look, say if you were the attorney and I'm looking at you, if I'm making a point, then I would say to the jury, well, there's two things I really keep in mind here, and it's what happened to the person in reality, and then what factors affected their ability to take my tests, something like that. So I teach to the jury. And good attorneys will try to get between you and the jury so that you're not looking at them and making eye contact and then fostering an alliance with them just because they may find you to be credible and they may like you. They'll try to block that and pull you, but I'm over here or something.
I wouldn't want to try to get in that arm wrestle with you. But
it's all you just learn that over time.
Yeah. So I know that another area that I'm passionate about is technology.
Yeah.
And right now, in the midst of COVID, we've all found ourselves, needing to use technology and telemedicine.
Right.
How do you think that might impact our legal work? And has that already happened with you since it's happened?
It's already happened. So this morning, all this week, I was supposed to have cases, and I do several cases a week. And they're all postponed, except for today. And what I think is evolving is a hybrid model. So the hybrid model would be, instead of all-day examinations or partial day examinations, the initial clinical interview is done over the internet via HIPAA compliant or HIPAA compatible. Actually, correct term is HIPAA compatible. Mm-hmm. HIPAA compliant is a misnomer. It's HIPAA compatible. You have to be compatible with HIPAA. And so I did the interview, and it was very interesting. The gentleman was somewhat distant from me here. He was in the San Joaquin Valley. And so I was able to interview him, and we went over all the things that you have to go over for privacy and seeing who's in the room and lighting, technological stuff. But it was really good. And I've been doing more and more of that just lately. The testing itself, the other part of the hybrid model is going to have to be another time. Mm-hmm. So we'll have to wait till the health issues are mitigated enough to feel safe to do the exam. And primarily it's the patient's safety. They're not my patient in a forensic setting, but my values and my ethics have to always govern my actions. So I have to inform them about risks. Technically, they're a more vulnerable individual, and I have to defer to their wishes, but I will examine during the COVID crisis because it's just going to go on for a while. But technology is really going to teach us a lot more. We've been a little asleep at the wheel neuropsychologically when it comes to technology, favoring approaches that are a little archaic in some respects.
Mm-hmm. And I know that we're both been having a lot of these discussions with leaders through the IOPC tele-neuropsychology initiative. When I think about legal work, I think one of the things we'll really need to consider, right, is the recordings, which has already kind of been an issue, right? And I think we've discussed even in Florida here, where it's almost becoming precedent to be asked to do neuropsychological assessment under recordings, not through telemedicine, but because we're, the court reporters coming in. Can you address first neuropsychological testing under recording in a typical office environment, and then we'll move with the concept of recording now that we're on telemedicine and the concerns we might have?
Sure. So you mean like in a legal situation?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So it depends on the states, but attorneys these days listen to their bars. So there's a defense bar, there's a plaintiff bar, and they have listservs. And anyone who does this work usually has a contact to listen into the chatter on a listserv, to gather intelligence about you, about your opponent. This is part of the martial art thing you have to factor in.
That's right.
Because there's another aspect of testimony that I think you have to bring, and that's a little bit of a competitor, but tamed down. You can be a respectful competitor, but if you take on more of a warrior mentality or martial art mentality, you have to scrutinize your opponent. And there's a common saying in war, and that is, if you know yourself well, you'll win 50% of the time. If you know your opponent well, you'll win 50% of the time. If you know your opponent well and you well, you'll win 100% of the time. So you have to, if you're going to put in that terms, and that's more of a warrior type approach to things. Attorneys have a right to record your examination, whether you like it or not. And you can move to have a protective order to protect that information. You can disclose white papers from all the neuropsychological guilds that speak about test security, third-party observers, all of that. It doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. So you can push hard, or attorneys can push hard to record that examination. And the ways around that are to disclose the audio tapes or the digital files to the expert on the other side, or to take a step back and say, I'm not doing it. Today I had a good example of a colleague of mine, well-respected, very bright, a tough opponent as an expert on the other side. I love facing tough opponents because they teach you, and they will teach you, and they will consult, and they will supervise and scrutinize your work. There's no better compliment than somebody scrutinizing your work. So this examiner is not wanting to have an audio recording of the actual testing for all the psychometric copyright issues that we think about, even though it's quite boring, because attorneys want to hear it, but they want to get the information, and then they'll look at the manuals, which they can get, and see if you followed the manual, and if you deviated too much, all of that. So I think that's just a reality that you have to deal with, and there's various ways to deal with that request, and various ways to get around it, but it's not a death sentence to your examination or your ability to do an examination. I wouldn't get too stressed out about that, even though some of my colleagues would disagree with me on that.
Thank you for addressing that. So I'm going to move on to another area that I know you're really passionate about, and also another arena, which is with pro athletes. So I'd like to switch from the courtroom to the community and then the arena where you also spend a lot of your time. Can you share some of the innovative practice models that you've done over your career in those areas?
Sure. Well, I think I have to just start with the first job I ever had was in a rehabilitation unit. I worked in a trauma center and I was on the acute rehab program for physically disabled individuals or injured, brain injured, and some other issues that brought them in, like arthritis, and they had problems with that and needed rehabilitation. That really grounded me in a team or multidisciplinary approach that was initially in an acute care setting, sometimes subacute, so they're not well enough to go into acute care, and then a post-acute when they're discharged and have outpatient. And to really work with them, I had to work across all settings. Like, say, for example, someone's emerging from a coma and they're minimally responsive. It's fascinating to work with somebody who's minimally responsive based on our traditional tools, but there's some nice coma recovery scales that are out there. And if you work in a post-acute setting and you work with patients that are minimally responsive, comatose, or emerging from a coma, it's fascinating to work with them and their families. So you follow a person theoretically from that minimally responsive to an acute care setting where they can tolerate more of a testing day or more of a treatment day to post-acute. And then the question that always frustrated me in my first 10 years was, what happens to these people after they're done? Because in 6 months, you could be out of all those programs.
Exactly.
And then what about the rest of their lives? So that's when I started doing home visits and community outings and kind of following people. And some patients I followed for 20 years. I had one patient who had 22 months, had a hemispherectomy because he had hemimegaloencephalopathy. So his left hemisphere was way too big. So they did a functional decortication where they just disconnected the white matter tracts anteriorly, posteriorly, and in the corpus callosum, and disconnected and floated the left hemisphere in the cerebrospinal fluid. Fascinating. Kid was 22 months, so language was emerged, dominance was emerging. But as we know, developmentally, the brain has backup systems. So his language is there, and now he's in his mid-20s.
Wow.
And he looks like a stroke presentation, a left CVA, so he's got the contralateral motor issues, a little bit of facial droop, but he's witty, he teases me. If I make a mistake, God forbid, then he picks it up. So the point is that really helped me understand how to work with people in the community. In a professional athlete setting, I've always been fascinated with what happens when athletes get their bell rung, because I don't want to say this too much publicly, but during the day I treat concussions and at night I try to give them. So when I was more aggressive and I mean, it's interesting when you knock somebody out. I don't think people appreciate, we can get all kind of, upset about that, but there's interesting feeling when you knock somebody out or when you hurt somebody. And plus and minus goes both ways. So that's part of us. That's that animal part of us. So I think when I got around professional athletes, I always kind of related to that. Mm-hmm. And started working with them and now take care of professional athletes in the Los Angeles area who've had concussions. But to do that, you have to be around them. You have to be in their setting. You can't be in your office. I'll go there. And they always appreciate that because they have busy schedules. You're not the most important doctor in their lives. So I've learned a lot from being around them.
So I wanted to know something about how you speak with a coach. So just like we kind of talked about a scenario with a lawyer, I'm going to take that karate do into the arena. How would you tell a coach that's worth, a $10 million player has to sit out now because they've had a concussion? How can you manage that? And then how would you talk with an athlete about that?
Right. Well, fortunately, neuropsychologists have done probably some of the best work in the last 15 years, 20 years, 25 years when it comes to sports-related concussions, starting with Jeff Barth and, kind of currently Ruben Medea, who oversees concussion management programs, and other colleagues that are developing this. So the leagues know and the players associations accept that there are things that we do to keep a player safe. And so fortunately, these pioneers have really opened the door. So I have a fair amount of leverage because coaches, athletic training staffs, the medical professionals, they all have been educated, and athletes have all been educated about the potential negative effects of concussions and how we manage them. So that really helps. But still, you have a coach. A common scenario would be with the Kings, 2011, 2012, and they're in the playoff race. And it's the first time they won their cup in years. They hadn't won a cup. So they're in that, I think it was 2011, 2012 season, 2012. And they're playing a team in the playoffs. I think they're playing the Blackhawks. And Blackhawks are a fantastic team, great team. Won 3 Stanley Cups in a row. And so
Wow.
Pretty awesome. Hard to do that. So the Kings are in a playoff game with them, and one of the top guys had a concussion, and I'm seeing him on Thursday. They have to travel on Friday for a game on Saturday. And fortunately, the athletic training staff and the medical staff know that I'm not seeing anybody until he meets a certain set of criteria. And that's usually exertion for a certain amount of time, blood pressure, heart rate being up, because if your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up, and you're still symptomatic, you're going to show the symptoms. It's a quick way to show it. So they have me come in, and I have to change my schedule to go in and see him. I go in very early. I had to drive into Los Angeles, but I see this athlete, nice guy, and we have a little rapport going back and forth. I develop a little rapport with them. And I tease.
How do you think your warrior mentality helps you build rapport with these athletes, especially in this kind of game time playoff setting?
Well, so I've known them from the preseason forward, and some of them I've known over several seasons. And then I usually go to a few games a year. And when they're all geared up, when they have everything on and they're waiting to go out on the ice, sometimes I'm there and I'll go up to them and go, all right, let's go. You good? You good? Let's go. And then they hit me with their sticks. It's just kind of a warrior thing, right? And then some guys who get in fights, I'll come up afterwards and say, hey man, tell me, what was your strategy there when you're fighting this guy? And why did you stop when he's on the ice? Don't you want to finish him a little bit? Because he's down, he's vulnerable, just finish him. So I'm teasing him halfway, but martial art, we would never stop. Go until there's no need to go any further. You just it's a moment of rage and violence that you take completely to the end. And then you move to the next opponent, next opponent, next opponent, next opponent, next opponent. But if you don't have that ability to go completely through somebody, you're going to hurt somebody more, or you'll be affected, or someone you love will be killed. So you have to have that mentality. So I ask him about that. So what happens there? First I say, Doc, it's a sport, dude. We're not going to put my skate across his throat. And I said, well, I'm not going to snap his leg. I said, okay, so there's rules here. Yeah, I get that. And so we have that little bit of rapport. And then that helps me when I have a difficult conversation with them. Like this one athlete, I had to tell him, look, you're still symptomatic, and I'm worried about your health. And I have to think about you. And I always have this conversation with them behind closed doors. I tell them, I'm loyal to you. You're my patient, not the organization. They don't pay me, and not the fans. I'm loyal to you, and I'm loyal to your family. And so I have to give them difficult news. I'll say that to them. I know you want to play, and I know you want to be there, but I'm worried about where you are right now, and I don't think you're healthy enough to play. I'll come back, once you get back from the trip, and we'll look at it again.
Yeah, I think what you're showing is, again, that humanity and that connection that you're having with them, and how you're also that diagnosis is leading to them having acceptance. And how do you think that helps them with the healing process, the recovery process from a concussion? Do you do follow-up care as well?
Yeah, I do. Well, first with the athletes, it gives them permission to have their symptoms, because there's such a pull to just suck it up and go forward, even when they're injured. We know that already. Right. Guys play all the time with fractures of various types or another. I mean, if you see them without the gear on, they're bruised up pretty much everywhere. had lost their teeth. I had my teeth knocked out years ago in a martial art thing. And I always check dental work and what do you do and how do you feel about implants and all that. We conversations about that.
So even, people in the field, when we get into a certain mentality of that warrior, hard, I used to think the hardboard soldier type mentality,
Right.
underreport those symptoms.
Right. And
so, yeah, how do you deal with them getting through, accepting the symptoms, and then the recovery process with them?
so usually they hear that you're there for them. You're in their best interest, and that's what you want to hear. And sometimes with the younger athletes, when they're a little confused, I'll say, like you always have this guy from very North Ontario, and he's 19 and he's in his first regular season at the NHL level. It's a huge thing, and he gets a concussion. They just haze him and check him into the board, smacks his head, or he gets an elbow to the head. Mm-hmm. He has a concussion, but he doesn't know how to manage it because he hasn't really had a concussion like this before. And so I'll say, hey, you want me to? I'm happy to talk with your parents if you like, because a lot of these folks have been coached by their parents or fathers coming up in hockey. So sometimes like that, I'll actually just talk to a parent and help them appreciate what's going on. And they help with the recovery and the healing and give that athlete permission. Within professional teams, they also have others have had concussions. So that helps with the recovery. And athletes will want their teammate to play, but they don't want them to be hurt. And they don't want to be hurt by an injured teammate either. So if someone comes out and the reaction time is just a little bit less than what it needs to be, that could cost them a game, and it could cost them a playoff, and it could cost them a lot of stuff, not just financial. But there's nothing worse than losing when you don't need to lose for a professional athlete. So I use all of that, and then the years of rapport with the athlete, I can come back and check with them because sometimes some of them have several concussions and they're worried about cumulative effects. So you have to have conversations with them, even when they're healthy. You have to have conversations about, are they good to go? Are they safe to go?
Yeah, definitely. One of the areas, again, applying telemedicine and technology, can you share how that's important to sports concussion management? Because I think that as sports neuropsychologists, we've kind of been working in that area already for, a long time.
For a decade plus. So it's essential. Like I love the fact that I can look at data gathered distally and be able to pull it together. But certainly evaluating athletes, like when we have a roster, let's kind of switch to soccer. We could have 22 soccer players that need to be examined in a day. And we have stations set up and we can do that because the technology is constant. You just have to deal with basic things with any technology, like bandwidth challenges, people using a mouse incorrectly, something like that. But I can gather a lot of data very quickly. That's pretty good. And so that's really helpful to me down the line when I have to reassess after a concussion. And then I can call up an athlete, say I have a player that I examined who's from Toronto, maybe the soccer team there. The Toronto soccer team, MLS team, trains not far from here during the preseason because there's still snow back where they are in the preseason. And so I'll correspond with my colleagues who take care of that team and share data back and forth very, very easily and make comparisons. And that really makes the job so much easier. It's seamless. We don't even think about it. It's just what we do.
Definitely. And, in the original days or the early days, there were a lot of papers in terms of how to have high fidelity testing, yes, computerized assessments, what happens when, they're supervised, who is the correct personnel to do so.
Exactly.
So I think those are some of the answers that we're going to be needing as we move forward with tele-neuropsychology and answering some, making some solutions there.
Right.
And one of the areas I thought that you brought up that I really liked is that you basically just showed that technology has expanded the role of a neuropsychologist, right, and also allowed more access, right? You're now able to manage 20 players in a day, right? So we've moved from a one-to-one kind of testing model to now being able to serve many more clients. How do you think that we could take those lessons learned today in the midst of the COVID pandemic to expand our services?
I really like some of the work that has come out from sports neuropsychology forward, because what we've done in sports neuropsychological services is, as you mentioned, expanded the reach of one neuropsychologist. You know, if you really add this, just to kind of put numbers on this, and there's several of us who take care of the teams in a city. Like it's amazing to be able to do that. But on a hockey roster, there's 22 players, but they have an American Hockey League affiliate, another 22, and they invite people to the camp. There could be 65 players to assess over 2 weeks. On a soccer team, there could be 22 to assess. So the point is, the reality is we don't have the resources to see everybody, and we will probably never have the resources, just like a physician doesn't have the resources to see everybody. And our physician colleagues long ago accepted that. So they have extenders, physician's assistants, nurse practitioners who probably are as adept as some of the physicians. And I think with psychologists, you have to do things that extend your service and accept that that's just the way it is, because the population is going to grow and the end is very small when it comes to people with a certain expertise. So the technology is forcing the issue. And I think we've been behind the curve on that for a long time, because we placed such a premium on paper and pencil testing for decades and really did all of our work in that area because we didn't really know. And psychology.
What do you think might be untapped opportunity for the field that we haven't taken advantage of, that we could, especially thinking about lack of resources? Any areas or populations you think that we'll be able to provide more access to?
Well, let me say in the clinical realm first. So let's say, like, I was having a conversation with individuals that oversee subacute facilities for brain injured and physically injured patients who can only do maybe an hour and a half of combined therapies a day because they're so debilitated, and then acute and post-acute settings. Now, this company has probably dozens of facilities across the United States, and they need people to help them understand what's going on cognitively. I enjoy working with speech and language pathologists and occupational therapists. They all can do some variant of cognitive rehabilitation, but not all of them can bring the expertise that any specialist can bring, in this case, a neuropsychologist. So we talked about using telehealth to go to those settings, if you will, and have monitors, set it all up, and assess with a team. You can assess, be part of a multidisciplinary conference, like you and I could be speaking like you're in Florida. And we could be having a team conference there where I could bring some expertise perhaps, or not, and share that. And that could make some difference in the patient's care. So the interventions are going to be consults, sharing of knowledge, like we do anytime when we teach, and then some interventions. And I think what's going to happen, at least in these settings, I suggested we could extend our services. This is where psychological testing technicians could come in. You can have people in different settings that you could train, kind of like an OT aide, a PT aide, a neuropsych aide, a psychometrician, who will do some of the services, and we could set up the technology to observe and oversee what's going on here, there. So we can get a lot done sooner and transmit those data immediately and have a more efficient way of accruing those data and getting the information out to people, and then driving the care where we need to drive the care, which is in a team conference, in a family conference, or doing psychotherapy with these patients. I think you can reach more then and do it well.
Yeah, I think you're showing that we can have our value beyond just the testing, but the knowledge and competencies we have already as psychologists, as neuropsychologists, with competencies in that neurological condition or even in a coordinated care. I think in some ways we have an advantage, right, over physical therapy or OT in telemedicine, because much of what we could do is what we're doing right now.
Yeah,
And
teaching. We're
Mhm.
used to sharing. We're used to consulting.
Definitely. Thank you for sharing. I'd like to move on to another area that you work in, so which is out on Capitol Hill. And so I want to discuss legislative advocacy and another area from, the courtroom to the professional arena to now another important part, which is advocacy, which I know now you're also very active with tele-neuropsychology and you've been in the past. Please share some of the work you've done, and then we'll integrate some information about technology into it as well later on.
Sure, sure. Well, earlier on in my career, and again, some of the things that kind of took me a different path there, I went into more professional practice type arenas. And um, I realized that I think I could do some leadership a bit and see things. And so I ran for office in my local chapter and was elected to the president of the local chapter of psychologists, Orange County Psychological Association. So did that and kind of learned a little bit. And then within a few years, I ran for the president of the California Psychological Association. Did not get it initially, which is great. I mean, when you fail, it can hurt, but it teaches you a lot. So ran again and then was elected. So I was president of the California Psychological Association. And during that whole tenure, I had to attend as president-elect the board meetings, and as president, oversee a conference, as past president, still attend board meetings. And then I became the representative from California to the American Psychological Association for 6 years. And so I saw governance at the national level. And I thought about running for the APA presidency, but it just, would be a big step, and you have to campaign and do all these things. And I didn't like the idea of traveling to Washington so often. So that's what it would kind of gut you. And if you don't, there's a bias. There's an East Coast bias when it comes to the APA presidency because of geography. I've mentioned this to the APA executive director. I think you guys are getting all the people from the Eastern Seaboard, and you're missing everybody else. Why don't you move APA to the middle of the country, make it accessible?
What a good point.
So yeah, it's an East Coast bias, it really is, that exists in psychology. If you look at everybody in leadership, there's a lot of East Coast bias, and I think you got to be careful about that. Just because of geography, but technology is changing that. So
Definitely.
You don't have to be there. You shouldn't have to be there. But the point is, I learned about governance, frustrating, because it's so slow, but it needs to be methodical to be fair. And then that just brought me into what I realized I could do more of, and that is to affect change at the regulatory level. So I got tired of seeing kids around this time who were getting concussions snowboarding, were wearing helmets. I said, wait a minute, how does that make sense? Kid has to wear a helmet when he rides a bike, when he rides a skateboard. Every state's different, but Florida and California are very similar that way. And so I helped write a helmet bill. I thought it was going to be this massive dissertation I have to put together. It's one of the easiest papers you'll ever write when you write a bill, because you just have to give a little literature, distill it, and then what you want, and then who's going to support it or not. 2 pages. It's a bill.
Nice.
It didn't pass, about 3 times because issues that had nothing to do with research, nothing to do with clinical outcomes, everything to do with what a governor thought or did not think, informed or not informed. And so if a governor felt like this was nanny government, then it wouldn't pass. They'll veto the bill. But it taught me a lot about change, and psychologists who do not participate in their legislative advocacy are really giving control of the profession to other people, because it doesn't matter what the Division 40 says. It doesn't matter what NAN, INS, AACN, American Board of Professional Neuropsychology. It doesn't matter what you say. What matters is what you say to legislators and how they regulate our profession. You can say all you want, write your little white, yellow, blue papers. People are going to look at them and say, yeah, you know what? So what? My constituents don't want you to do that, so I'm not going to do it because I want to get elected again.
And you bring up something that's a great transition to a question I had, which was, can you give an example of how you could speak to a senator to pass a law? How can a neuropsychologist influence passing laws, and especially right now in the crisis, tele-neuropsychology, make sure we get paid, right? And we've had some professionals, obviously Dr. Puente has been, very active his whole career in this. But how do we talk to a senator or legislator? Can you give an example of how you do that?
Sure, respectfully, always respectfully, because they are elected. They may be elected by someone other than you, but you have to be respectful, and you respect their arena. You dress appropriately, you conduct yourself appropriately. One of the most beautiful things you'll ever see is a governmental process in movement, because if done properly, it's cordial. You disagree, sometimes quite loudly, but then you take a vote, and you may not like the vote, but that's a democracy. We've had some issues lately where people have been insulting, and we have examples of that. But for the most part, I felt like most politicians are very honorable. They may do things on the side that get them in trouble, but I love the process, and I think the process is admirable. So you always are respectful and speak to the humanness of the issue. Like, for example, when it came to concussion management and mandating that at the high school level and above, we had bills introduced and passed. It's very easy to talk about that because you bring an example of, say, an athlete that went back to play when he shouldn't have, and he sustained a severe traumatic brain injury. Years ago, we had second impact syndrome was thought to be a primary issue. It's rare, but it speaks to the brain being already in a neurometabolic cascade downward, and then it's vulnerable. So you hit it again, and then you have massive edema, and in some cases herniation, and then an athlete will die, or they'll have severe brain trauma and residual deficits for the rest of their lives. So we introduce the humanness, and we say, usually in talking points, 2 or 3 talking points. We want to talk with you about a bill. It's AB so-and-so for Assembly bill, or Senate bill, S something, always an acronym and then a number. And we have 3 points that we're worried about with this bill. And here they are. You give them the paperwork if you talk to them or their staffers. And that is, if we don't have better control over the management of concussions at all levels, then we're going to have an event like this that happened with an athlete in the state of Washington last year. And I look around the room because there's always pictures. And I see someone who's maybe a younger senator, and they have pictures of children and sports and things. And then I'll use that as I talk to them about, like, the younger athlete I'm really worried about, someone who's just starting to play pop water, or a lot of the girls are so competitive now in soccer and sports. And so we really need to think about that next generation. I don't have to mention their kids, but almost on cue, they'll say, I've been thinking about that. My son just hates to wear a helmet when he skateboards. But I'll go from that and leverage, and then always end with, well, these are the things that we would like. Can we have your support? You always have to close the deal. Can you support us? Do we have your support or not? If you don't close the deal, then you're going to walk away with ambiguity, and then you follow up. And regardless of the outcome, you always thank them, because you're representing the profession, and you better present in a way that is memorable to them, because they may not agree this time, but I can almost guarantee next time you built a relationship with them. And so they may call you sometimes and say, Dr. Salinas, I'd like to hear what you're thinking about this whole telehealth and billing issue, because they trust you. Mm-hmm. That's the intervention. You want to trust, so that they'll be there to talk with you about regulatory changes.
Thank you. And how do you think that technology has helped to rally us to have a collective voice when we have to go to the table in terms of from state to state? How have you seen that play a role in advocacy and your work?
What I love about what we're doing now is we're talking to each other, and we're even now in the whole telehealth and tele-neuropsych, we're meeting nationally via the internet and calls and marshaling resources. The folks in their 20s, their teens, 20s in particular, are really passionate about issues. Take all the shootings that have happened in their schools. There are issues that they are worried about. And there's a lot of raw energy there that can be very polished. So I think you have to acknowledge they have legitimate points, and then let them know we have a system to address your points. So here's how we can do it. and let's help you take that energy, put it together, and move into something that's actionable. Instead of becoming anarchists, you want to be kind of a politically astute anarchist. And then you have to really stay the course to get change, because a change can happen immediately, but more often than not, it takes sometimes a decade. But it will come if you persist. You just have to hang in there. Look at all the movements in our country over the past years, from slavery to giving women the right to vote, to allowing my grandparents to marry. They couldn't marry in California in the 40s. They had to go to New Mexico because it was interracial.
Mhm.
Asian and Mexican can't marry. That's ridiculous now, right? But
Mhm.
that changed because the law changed and because someone persisted and said, that's not right. We're about what's right, not who's right. But you have to be patient with the process.
Yeah. And I think another thing that over the years that I admire you in terms of your leadership is that there's no voice that should be unheard. And I think with what you're saying is that collective voice that's assembling and becoming stronger, and instead of an individual. With that, I think you've given me a lot of confidence over the years. I really appreciate you being on this with me today. And I think the next step is I'm very excited, having a virtual summit,
Uh-huh.
and we're going to be focusing on digital transformation in brain health. And that's going to be in June 18th, 2020. We're going to be taking submissions. We have a scientific committee. And so, for any listeners out there, we're going to be having a portal to start taking your submissions today. And we're excited. Thank you very much, Dr. Lechuga.
It's my pleasure. Thank you. Appreciate you doing this.